Believe it or not, vampires, these mythological beings who are supposed to drain the life out of humans, have an uncanny appeal that has transcended time and culture. There's something universally fascinating about these creatures of the night. Perhaps it's their promise of eternal life, or maybe it's their supernatural abilities that captivate us. Whatever the reason, vampires have sunk their teeth into our collective consciousness, refusing to let go. Throughout history, these immortal beings have been depicted in a variety of ways. From the terrifying bloodsuckers of Eastern European folklore to the romanticized figures of Victorian literature, vampires have always been a source of intrigue and fear. But why is it that we are so drawn to these creatures who are, by all accounts, supposed to be our predators? One reason might be their immortality. The idea of living forever, of being immune to the passage of time and the ravages of age, is a concept that is both terrifying and appealing. Vampires, with their eternal youth and endless lives, embody this paradoxical desire. They are a symbol of our longing for permanence in a world that is constantly changing. But it's not just their immortality that draws us in. There's also the allure of their supernatural powers, the ability to transform into bats, to control the minds of others, to move with superhuman speed. These are abilities that we, as mere mortals, can only dream of. And yet, in the figure of the vampire, these dreams become a terrifying reality. There's also the mystery that surrounds these creatures. The secretive nature of their existence, the hidden worlds they inhabit. These are things that stir our curiosity and ignite our imagination. They are the embodiment of the unknown, the embodiment of the otherworldly, and it's this that makes them so irresistible. They are the night creatures that have haunted our dreams for centuries, but where did they originate? As we delve deeper into the history and mythology of vampires, we'll uncover the roots of this fascination, tracing it back to its ancient origins. So let's begin our journey into the darkness, where the allure of the vampire awaits. To uncover the roots of vampire mythology, we must journey back to ancient times. The cradle of civilization, Mesopotamia, gave birth to one of the earliest vampire-like creatures, the Lilitu. The Lilitu was a night demon that preyed on men and infants, a far cry from the suave and charming vampires of today. These creatures were feared rather than romanticized, their monstrous nature serving as a cautionary tale for the people. In ancient Greece we find the Lamia, a malicious creature with a serpentine lower body and a human upper half. The Lamia was known to feed on the blood of young men, just as the Lilitu did. But there was a tragic element to the Lamia. According to Greek mythology, she was a queen transformed into a monster by the jealous goddess Hera. This tale adds a layer of complexity to the vampire myth, introducing the concept of a cursed existence. The Romans too had their own version of the vampire. The Strix was a nocturnal bird of ill omen, often associated with witchcraft and sorcery. It was said to feed on the blood and flesh of humans, particularly children. Again, we see the vampire as a monstrous, threatening figure, a stark contrast to the alluring creatures we know today. These early depictions of vampire-like creatures were raw and terrifying, embodying fears and superstitions of the times. They lacked the elegance and sophistication that would come to define the modern vampire. But they formed the foundation upon which the vampire myth was built. They represented the darker side of human nature, our fear of the unknown, and the mysteries of life and death. As civilizations evolved, so did their vampire myths. The creatures became less monstrous and more human, their stories filled with tragedy and romance. The vampire myth transitioned from simple horror tales to complex narratives of love, power, and immortality. As civilizations evolved, so did their vampire myths, becoming more complex and intriguing. The Middle Ages were a fertile ground for the evolution of the vampire myth. This was a time when fear and superstition ran rampant, creating the perfect environment for the vampire to thrive in the collective imagination. In Eastern Europe, the vampire was not the suave and seductive creature we often see portrayed in modern media. Instead, it was a horrifying entity, closely associated with disease outbreaks and death. When a community was struck by a sudden and inexplicable illness, it was not uncommon for people to point their fingers at the undead. The vampire, they believed, was a restless soul, returning from the grave to feed on the life force of the living, thereby spreading disease and despair. The fear of these nocturnal predators was so intense that it gave rise to vampire hunts, where the villagers would exhume bodies, driven by the dread of the undead. The corpse, if found to be unusually preserved, or if blood was found around the mouth, was considered a vampire. To prevent it from rising again, they would resort to gruesome protective rituals. From staking through the heart to decapitation and burning, the methods employed reflected the sheer terror these creatures invoked. It's important to understand that these practices were not born out of malice, but out of fear, and a desperate need to protect the community. The world was a mysterious and often terrifying place, and the vampire served as an explanation for the unexplainable, the sudden death of a loved one, the spread of disease, the loss of livestock. It personified the unknown, the unseen threats that lurked in the shadows. The vampire of the Middle Ages was a terrifying creature, far from the charismatic figures we know today. It was a symbol of dread, a manifestation of the deepest fears of a time when life was fraught with danger and uncertainty. It was not a figure of romance or allure, but a nightmarish entity that haunted the darkest corners of the medieval imagination. The 19th century marked a turning point for the vampire myth, with the creature becoming more human and less monstrous. This era was a time of great change, not only in society, but also in how we viewed the supernatural. The vampire, once seen as a pure embodiment of evil, began to take on a more complex and sympathetic persona. This shift can be largely attributed to the influence of literature. The 19th century was a golden age for vampire fiction, with numerous authors exploring the vampire myth in new and innovative ways. At the forefront of this movement was Bram Stoker's Dracula, a novel that would forever change the way we perceive vampires. In Dracula, Stoker presents the vampire not as a mindless monster, but as a tragic figure, cursed with immortality. The titular character, Count Dracula, is intelligent, cultured, and deeply lonely, yearning for human companionship, even as he preys on humanity. Through this portrayal, Stoker humanizes the vampire, making it a character that readers can empathize with, and even, in some cases, root for. But it wasn't just Dracula that contributed to the romanticization of the vampire. Other works of the time, such as Sheridan Le Fanu's Carmilla, also played a part. These narratives introduced the concept of the vampire as a cursed being, forever doomed to walk the earth in search of blood, trapped in an endless cycle of death and rebirth. The vampire became a symbol of tragedy, a creature trapped by its own nature, unable to change or escape its fate. This shift in portrayal had a profound impact on the vampire myth, altering not only how we view vampires, but also how we view ourselves. Through the lens of the vampire, we are able to explore themes of mortality, loneliness, and the human condition. The vampire had transformed from a demonic creature to a tragic hero, a trend that would continue into the modern era. In the 20th and 21st centuries, vampires have taken on new forms and meanings. No longer just the stuff of folklore and Gothic literature, they've infiltrated our modern culture, reflecting our evolving fears and desires. Modern literature has given us a diverse array of vampire characters. Bram Stoker's Dracula may have set the stage, but contemporary authors have expanded the play. From Anne Rice's philosophical immortals to Stephenie Meyer's sparkling teenagers, these vampires are a far cry from their monstrous ancestors. They are nuanced, often struggling with their nature and questioning their existence. They mirror our own existential dilemmas, making them both relatable and intriguing. The silver screen and television have also been integral in shaping our perception of the modern vampire. The classic image of a caped, bloodthirsty figure has been replaced by a variety of portrayals. We have the seductive vampires of The Vampire Diaries, the conflicted anti-hero in Angel, and even the comedic undead of What We Do in the Shadows. Each representation is unique, reflecting the diversity of our society and our multifaceted fears and desires. Vampires in modern media are not just predators. They're often portrayed as victims of their condition, cursed with eternal life. This shift from villain to victim, from monster to romantic hero, mirrors our society's changing attitudes towards the other. It reflects our growing empathy and our ability to see beyond the surface, to understand that not everything that is different is necessarily evil. The modern vampire also reflects our desires. Whether it's the allure of eternal youth, the promise of power, or the thrill of danger, vampires embody what humans secretly yearn for. They are the forbidden fruit, the dark temptation that we cannot resist. From ancient demon to modern anti-hero, the vampire continues to evolve, a testament to our enduring fascination with the unknown.